Okay, here we are. We are live. Wait a second for everyone to come, and we'll begin. So this week we're starting the book of Shemais, the book of Exodus. We finished last week the book of Bereshis in the yearly cycle. We're 1/5 of the way back to Simchas Torah for those keeping score at home. Okay, so we're going to dive in right into the beginning of the Parsha, the beginning of the book of Exodus, right? So what happens is the Pharaoh at the time takes a whole new approach to the Jewish people. So there's a debate amongst the Jewish scholars in the Talmud. One says that there was actually a new king who did not know Joseph. And the other one says that no, he knew Joseph. It was the same guy. But he chose that he made himself into a new person as if he didn't know Joseph and didn't remember all the good things that Joseph had done for the land of Egypt and specifically for the pharaohs. So, at any rate, he says as follows. We'll dive right in. And Egypt says, "Vayakam el chadash ha-Mitzrayim," a new king comes into Egypt. Asher lo yada es Yosef, that didn't know Joseph. Vayomer el amoy, and the Pharaoh says to his nation, "Hine am bnei Yisrael rav atzum mimenu." The Jewish nation is becoming large, and there's going to be a war, and they're going to join our enemies. Right? This is a trope, right? A trope that goes back all the way to the pharaohs. So this is nothing new that people say that Jewish people have dual allegiances, right? And that they're not going to defend the country where they live in. So he decides to enslave them, right? He makes the tax collectors to afflict them, and they start building cities for Pharaoh. And the Torah says, right? The more that they were oppressed, the more the Jewish people prospered. And the Egyptians became disgusted with the Jewish people, right? The Egyptians, they started treating the Jews badly with hard labor, and they made their lives bitter, right? If you're familiar with the Passover Seder, a lot of this is sure is familiar to you, and the idea of the bitterness, right? With brick with bricks and mortar. And all hard work. Okay. So now Pharaoh has these astronomers, whatever you want to call them, these witchcraft type of people, really astronomers in this case, but later on comes the other type of people, but let's call them the astronomers for now. And he realizes that there's going to be born a baby boy who is going to come and save the Jewish people. So Pharaoh decides to call a meeting. And the meeting is between the Pharaoh and the Jewish midwives. And here begins the main point of our discussion today. So he says as follows. Pharaoh sends for the Jewish midwives. One's name is Shifra, the other's name is Puah. And he says as follows. When you see that the Jewish women are giving birth, and you'll see it on the birthing stone, if it's a boy, you shall kill him, and if it's a girl, you shall let her live. So right away, Rashi, the foremost commentator on the Torah, who's there to explain the simple explanation of the Torah, that's what he says, that his job is. So he says as follows, Shifra is Yocheved. Why is she called Shifra? Because Shemesha Peres es Havlad, she improves the newborn by stretching out the newborn. Okay? And the next one is Puah. Who's Puah? So Miriam. This is Miriam that she would coo, like poo-poo, right? The babies, right? And calm the baby down. Okay? So in other words, their names were not Shifra and Puah, but that was their job description. Shifra and Puah was their job description. So she says as follows. The Torah continues, that the midwives feared God, right? That they did not listen to the Pharaoh, and they let the Jewish boys live. So Pharaoh calls them back. He says, "Why aren't you listening?" So they explain themselves. They said, "No. It's not so simple." They said, "Ki loy kanashim ha-mitzriyos ha-ivrios." The Jewish women are different than the Egyptian women. And they use the word ki chayos hena. They are like animals. How are they like animals? Well, Rashi's going to explain. But literally it means that they're like midwives, right? And when they come, by the time the midwife shows up, they're already given birth, right? So later, in the end of the verse, it says, "Vayhi ki yaru hamiyaldas es halokim vayas lahem batim," right? So God took care of them, and He made for them houses. So Rashi comments, "Ki chayos hena." What does it mean that they are like midwives? Right? So Rashi explains that they had very good skills, but he gives another explanation that our rabbis say that they were compared to chayos, like animals. Chayos also means animals. What does it mean they were like animals? Then an animal doesn't need a midwife, right? Animals give birth without a midwife. So why are they animals? Because we see in the last week's Torah portion, we talked about Jacob giving the blessings to his children, right? He blesses many of them to be like animals. He blesses Yehuda to be like an aryeh, like a lion. Binyamin is a ze'ev. Yosef is a shar, is a wolf. Joseph is compared to an ox. Naphtali is compared to a gazelle, right? So we see here that the Jewish people are like animals, so they don't need midwives. Okay, that's what Rashi explains. And the next thing he explains is when He made them houses. What does it mean? It doesn't mean actual houses, because that wouldn't be so impressive. What does it mean? It means that they were given the houses of Kahuna, of the priestly family, Ulavia, and the Levite family, Umalchus, and the royal family, because the King David was descendant of Miriam. So that is what it's referring to. Okay, so the question is, Rashi is supposed to be commenting on the simple explanation of the verse, right? He says that he's coming to explain what a 5-year-old's questions would be. So the first question is, why does Rashi have to explain, why is he forced to explain that Shifra and Pua were Yocheved and Miriam, right? If you're saying that the Torah calls them Shifra and Pua, why not? That was their names. Why do you have to say no? That was just their job description. They were not Shifra and Pua. And that's the first question. The second question is that later at the end, right, it says that he vayas lahem batim, right, that He made them houses. So why doesn't He just explain that it was simply houses? Or he could have said that it means families, right? Right, that they were able to have a family, right? That even though the Pharaoh should have punished them for not listening, they should have been given a family. They were given the opportunity to have families. And we have this idea in Torah that house refers to families or wives or families coming from your wife, right? So for example, in the Talmud, the word for whenever the rabbis in the Talmud refer to their wives, they say the word divishu, which translates from Aramaic and has the same kind of word as in Hebrew of his home, right? So why didn't Rashi just say, yeah, they were given, instead of being punished by the Pharaoh, they were given the opportunity to have families, right? To continue living their lives. Why does Rashi have to go out of his way, and he's compelled to say that, no, it means that they had not just homes, or families, it means they had these special families, that Aaron, the high priest, and King David would come from them. So, in order to understand this whole idea, what's going on here, we're going to have to ask even a bigger question. If you're going to call the midwives of the Jewish people, right, as we said earlier in the beginning, right, that King Pharaoh calls a meeting of the Lemiyaldos Ha'ivrios to the Jewish midwives. Why? You would think it would be a big convention, right? Especially, the Torah says that they were multiplying they used the word fruitful and swarmed, That was a trope again by the Egyptians, right? They're saying these people are swarming like flies, right? So they're having, and Rashi explains, what does it mean? They're having actually 6 babies at once, right? That was the norm in the Jewish, in the Jewish at that time in the Jewish families, that Jewish women were having 6 babies at a time, sextuplets, right? So you're having sextuplets, and in this big nation, and they're getting larger and larger to the point the Egyptians feel so threatened that they have to put the Jewish people in slavery, and there's only 2 midwives for the whole nation. So a 5-year-old, right, who's learning the Chumash is going to say, I don't understand. You have to have, for every birth, there's a midwife, right? If you go to a hospital in a small city, even here like Duluth, right, there's on-call nurses and on-call doctors all hours of the night. It's not possible, even for a small amount of people, right, to have only two midwives on call. So, and that's in a regular situation. Here we're saying that no, they're having 6 babies at a time. You probably need more than two midwives just to get through that kind of procedure. So, and then we could go further, trying to understand what's going on here. So, if they go to Pharaoh and they say that, what's their answer to Pharaoh? The answer to the Pharaoh is that no, they don't need midwives. The Jewish women, right? They give birth. They say they're going to give birth, and by the time we get there, it's already too late. They already gave birth, so we're not able to do what you want, which is to kill the boys. So why do we need? So that that's the case. Why do you need midwives at all? Why do you need even 2 if they're having babies, right? So we have to say that what they answered to the Pharaoh must have been the truth, because this is something. There's actually in halacha, there's actually an idea that it's in Aramaic. It's that milsa David legloya lemishaker insha, which literally translates as something that will eventually come out. People don't lie about, which basically means that if something is so obviously disproven, right, by a simple investigation, people don't lie about it, right? So, for example, if you go to somebody and they say, no, I'm home every night at 8 o'clock, it's not possible, I was in this place, another place at 8 o'clock, so they'll come the next night at 8 o'clock, right? And they'll see if this person's at home or not. So because it's something that's so easily proven or disproven, right, so people don't lie. That's the general rule. So in this case, right, these people in Yocheved and Miriam, or Shifra and Pua, as they were called in the Torah, are not punished, right? So obviously, the Pharaoh must have accepted their explanation. So it must be they were actually saying the truth, that the Egyptians understood that this was the case, that Jewish women were actually having babies on their own without a midwife. So then again, come back. So what are the midwives doing if they don't need midwives? Then why did the Pharaoh have this convention of midwives and only 2 show up, right? And even 2 doesn't make sense. We have to figure out what was going on here. So here's the explanation, as follows: these Jewish women were playing a different role of midwives. They were not regular midwives to actually help in the birthing process, but they were kind of there for emergencies and to calm down the Jewish women who were giving birth. So they knew that if there was something go wrong, there would be a midwives who would come and help. And by the way, if you go back to the beginning, right, when we explained what is Shifra and Pua, both of them are actually referring to the jobs they do with the babies, right? Shifra means that she kind of stretches the limbs out of the baby, right? Gets the baby going, moving, gets the blood pumping. And the Pua means that she calms the babies down, right? So both of those are in reference to the babies. So actually, even in their job descriptions itself, they're not there really to help the mothers, right? They're really there to help the babies after the fact, calm them down, right? So the mothers are know that their babies are going to be okay. So, but again, still, right? Like we said earlier, that there were 6. Women were having 6 babies at a time. So it was still an incredible job, and the fact that they risked their lives, right, by not killing the boys. So it must be that these women were exceptional women, right? 2 women on call for the entire Jewish nation, risking their lives. So Rashi has to explain this. who are these special women who are risking their lives and being on call probably 24/7 if you're going to be helping out a whole Jewish nation. Rashi says these are not regular women. These are not Shifra and Pua in the simple sense. There must be, these are special women. And we look throughout the Chumash, we don't find any special women called Shifra and Pua. So who were the special women of that time? It was Yocheved and Miriam, right? Because later on, we're going to learn the story of Yocheved and Miriam. Yocheved is married to Amram, who is, besides the fact that she becomes later the mother of Moses, this is before that, she was married to Amram. Moses' father was leader of the Jewish people at that time. And Miriam was also a special girl, even at a young age, right? She cares for Moses, we learn. Even the birth of Moses is attributed to her because when this decree came and they were going to they were throwing the boys into the Nile River, so Amram, the father of Miriam and Aaron, and later Moses says, okay, I'm done having children, right? And he gets divorced because what's the point? They're going to throw the babies into the water. So Miriam comes and says, you're worse than Paro. I'm worse than Paro? You're saying to your own father, I'm worse than Paro? She says, yes, you're worse than Paro. Why? Because Paro only decreed that the boys should be thrown into the Nile. And you're not even letting girls being born. So right away, Amram gets remarried to his wife. And by the way, all the Jewish people followed Amram, right? That they all divorced their wives when Amram, the leader of the Jewish people, divorces his wife. And then when he gets remarried, all the Jewish people get remarried. And Moses is born from that second marriage. So Miriam was also a very special woman. So we know that who the special women in Egypt were. So it must be, Rashi says, that these women were, Shifra and Pua was Yocheved and Miriam. And now, as far as the reward goes, so we know why Pharaoh didn't punish them, right? He didn't punish them because they didn't do anything wrong, right? The Egyptians were very good investigators, and they probably investigated the situation, right? And they understood that the Jewish women were giving birth on their own, and that these women were only coming later to kind of help out. So Rashi has to explain that obviously the reward can't just be that they had families, right? Because that would have happened anyways, because they weren't punished. They didn't do anything illegal in Egypt at that time. So what is the reward for being the midwives and risking their life and standing up to the Pharaoh, right? So what is the reward that they get? So Rashi says it can't just be that the women were that they were going to have families, but it must be something special, right? And what is the something special that Rashi says that Batim refers to? It refers to houses, meaning the houses of the Kohanim. That's going to be Aaron. Is going to come from Yocheved, right? Her son Aaron, and from Miriam is going to come King David, the Jewish kings. So we see this idea of, just like they built Jewish homes by keeping the Jewish people alive, by calming the Jewish women down and standing up to the Pharaoh, so God gives them measure for measure. And we have this idea of measure for measure brought down in the Torah many times. So for example, we'll just give a couple examples, right? Like the sin of the tree of knowledge, right? So when it comes to the snake, right? Because he had the snake was his cunningness, I guess is the right way to say it, makes Adam and Eve sin. Therefore, he becomes the most cursed, and he brought curse and death to the world. He becomes the most cursed of all the animals, right? Cain and Abel, right? So the punishment is that for Cain, that just when he opened the earth for his brother, right? He committed the first murder in the history of the world. You opened the earth for your brother, so therefore the earth is not going to open for you, and became very hard for him to and for the rest of humanity to work the land, right? The land did not produce produce in the normal way. And of course, in a couple of weeks, we're going to have the story of the death of the firstborn. God says, you mess with my firstborn child. Who's my firstborn child? My firstborn child is the Jewish people, right? And he says to Pharaoh, you should tell him my firstborn son is Israel, right? And therefore, if you don't, right, and already, I think in this week's Parsha actually, that he says, or maybe it's the beginning of next week, and he says, right, if you don't let the Jewish people go, I'm going to kill your firstborn, right? Measure for measure. That idea is brought many, many times in the Torah. And the same thing applies in a good way. That just like people are punished in the exact way that they were sinned, so too when it comes to good things. That people are rewarded in the way that they did things. So, for example, somebody mentioned this week's Parsha we're talking about now is Miriam. Miriam, she waited for Moses, right? That in this week's Torah portion, it says that she watches from Moses to see what's going to happen to him. So the Torah tells us that later, much later, in the book of, I think it's in the book of, I shouldn't say things I don't remember. So later in the desert, she is afflicted with saras, right? She says, Lashon Hara, she says not nice things about Moses. So God punishes her with saras, which is a leprosy. And the way it works for leprosy is that the Torah says you have to wait 7 days in order to become pure. So 7 days she gets saras, and she is then allowed to continue to come back into the camp of Israel, and then they could and rejoin the Jewish people. So in those 7 days, the Jewish people did not travel, right? The Jewish people had 42 travels throughout the desert, and some days they were traveling for 1 day, sometimes for many years. But in that case, God waited for them to travel for those 7 days. That Miriam shouldn't be left behind, even though she had saras and she was just one person, but because she had waited for Moses as a baby, the entire Jewish people, and really God himself, waits for Miriam. So we see this idea, right, that also when it comes to Joseph, we're going to have in a couple of weeks, that Joseph, and last week as well, right, Joseph says, please take me out of Egypt, and this is the promise that there's going to be a redemption from Egypt, right? Joseph says that you're going to take me out of Egypt. So Moses goes and takes Joseph's bones out of Egypt and brings him to almost the land of Israel, right? And we know Moses does not enter the land of Israel, but because Moses did that for Joseph, Moses is buried by God himself, right? And even Joseph, who had done the same favor for his father, right, and taken his father out of Egypt and brought him to, in last week's Parsha, and brings him to be buried in the Maras Machpelah, in the cave of the Machpelah in Hebron. And last week's Parsha, so Joseph is taken care of by Moses. Moses did that for Joseph, and he's rewarded that God himself buries him. So we see this idea. So the same idea here, that these women, they help establish the Jewish nation. What is their reward? Their reward is that they are able to establish these special dynasties within the Jewish people, the priestly dynasty and the Davidic dynasty, and the royal dynasty of King David. So we see here something also very important, that both Miriam and Yocheved had actually very special children and even grandchildren who are not mentioned in this week's who are not mentioned as the reward. You would say, you know what, at that time Moses was not born, right? And Yocheved was probably too young to have children at that time. Or even if she did, we don't know about them at this point. So why don't we say that the reward for Yocheved and Miriam is that Miriam is going to... Why didn't the Torah say, the reward for Yocheved is that she's going to have a boy named Moses who's going to be the redeemer of the Jewish people. He's going to bring the Torah down from Mount Sinai, and we're going to call the Torah Moses' law until the end of time. So why isn't that the reward? Or for Yocheved, she had a son who was named, I think it was a son or a grandson, named Nachshon, right? Who ends up being the person who walks into the sea, and before it split, right, he takes that leap of faith, and the sea splits, and he becomes a leader of the Jewish people, a leader of his tribe, of the tribe of Judah. Like we said, eventually King David comes from him, right? Or even just saying the King David is going to come from her. Why do we have to say that? No, it has to be this dynasty that is going to come, right? That, besides the fact that obviously that we're talking that it has to be measure for measure, but we also see, because, right, they created a dynastic movement of the Jewish people which lives to this day, but we also see here what it means for what is the goal of a Jewish mother, right, of a Jewish parent, and specifically we're talking about mothers here, but any Jewish parent, is that we want that our children should be not just we want our children to be successful as an individual, but our goal is to create generations. generation onto generation that is going to come until the coming of Mashiach. That will bring Mashiach eventually. So we see here how important it is that we're not trying to make our children into this, one hit wonder, right? That's not what it's about. It's creating homes and generations of children, right? Creating essentially the Jewish people itself. So the reward for them was the same thing, that they created the entire Jewish people. They allowed the Jewish people to be born by helping them and by standing up to the Pharaoh. They have their specific dynasties, which are generations of Kohanim, generations of Leviim, generations of kings, and eventually the Mashiach himself. So, but again, it's not about that one individual. It's not about trying to make one more, but really to make many more. And really, you could even say that by making one more, you're making many more, right? In other words, it doesn't mean that you have to always affect, it's not enough that I'm doing what I'm doing. I'm helping one person, or I'm helping my one child, or I'm helping, right? But you have to think of it as this is the chain, right? This one person is not just an individual. He represents thousands of years coming before and after. All right. Everybody have a good Shabbos and a wonderful rest of your week. We'll see you next week.